The sun rises differently over the Sterling Ranch. It's not just the way the light hits the rolling hills of the 45-acre estate, but the weight of the history those hills carry. For Artie Sterling, every inch of this dirt is a piece of his soul. Born in the very same house his parents built back in 1905, Artie is a man out of time. Back then, this part of the county was nothing but cattle trails, dust, and the promise of hard work. Today, the urban sprawl is hungry, devouring the green spaces and replacing them with cookie-cutter subdivisions. But the Sterling Ranch stands firm, a stubborn island of tradition in a sea of modernization. At 78 years old, Artie doesn't move as fast as he used to, but his eyes are as sharp as a hawk's. He spent 40 years of his life working for the County Surveyor's office. While most people look at a field and see grass, Artie sees coordinates, boundary lines, and historical markers. He literally mapped this entire county, measuring it foot by foot until the land was etched into his brain like a thumbprint. He knows exactly where his property ends and the world begins, or at least he thought he did. Artie's true pride and joy, however, isn't just the land, it's what sits on it. Nestled inside a meticulously restored barn is a collection of vintage pickup trucks that would make any collector weep. These aren't junkers or rusted-out shells. They are masterpieces. There's the 1952 Chevy 3100, worth a cool $65,000. Then there's the mint-condition 1967 Ford F100, valued at $45,000, and his personal favorite, a 1971 Chevrolet C10 that he spent years restoring with his own two hands. To Artie, these trucks represent a time when things were built to last, much like the ranch itself. But the world around the ranch was changing. About 15 years ago, a massive developer bought the neighboring parcel of land. They tore down the trees, leveled the hills, and erected 50 generic beige homes, a subdivision they called the Meadows. Along with the homes came a homeowners association, HOA, a governing body meant to keep the grass trimmed and the mailboxes uniform. For a decade, there was an uneasy peace. Artie kept to himself, tending his small cattle operation and polishing his chrome. He was a ghost to the suburbanites, a relic of the past they ignored as they drove their SUVs to the community pool. But that peace shattered 5 years ago when Richard Thorne was elected HOA President. Richard was a retired real estate attorney with too much time on his hands and a desperate need for control. He didn't just want to manage the subdivision, he wanted to rule it like his own personal fiefdom. He handed out fines for the wrong shade of curtains and threatening letters for grass that was a quarter-inch too long. But Richard had a specific obsession: the Sterling Ranch. To Richard, Artie's ranch wasn't a historic landmark. It was an eyesore. He claimed that the sight of Artie's vintage trucks, visible from the windows of the more expensive homes, was dragging down the property values of the neighborhood. Richard didn't care that the ranch had been there a century before the first foundation of the Meadows was poured. He wanted the trucks gone, the cattle removed, and the old man neutralized. Richard began his campaign of intimidation slowly, standing at the edge of the property line with a clipboard, snapping photos and scowling. Artie would just tip his cap and keep working, thinking it was just a bored man with a hobby. He didn't realize that Richard was digging through old, flawed records, looking for a way to swallow the Sterling Ranch whole. What Artie didn't know was that Richard wasn't just planning to fine him. He was planning to take his land, his trucks, and his legacy by claiming Artie had been living on HOA property for 15 years. The battle for the 120-year-old ranch was about to begin, and the first shot was a demand for $45,000 in back dues. The tension between the Sterling Ranch and the Meadows didn't explode overnight. It was a slow, calculated burn orchestrated by Richard Thorne. For Richard, a man who had built a career on the fine print of real estate law, the ranch was an anomaly that needed to be corrected. He spent his afternoons walking the perimeter of the subdivision, his leather-bound clipboard in hand, looking like a general surveying a battlefield. He wasn't just looking at the grass height, he was looking for a weakness. Richard's obsession grew into a formal campaign during the HOA's monthly board meetings, held in the pristine, air-conditioned clubhouse that sat suspiciously close to the ranch's eastern fence. He would show slide decks to the board members, most of whom were too intimidated by his legal jargon to disagree, pointing out Artie, unsightly collection of vintage trucks. "These are not mere vehicles," Richard would argue, his voice dripping with practiced authority. "They are industrial debris. They represent a decline in the aesthetic standards we all signed up for. Every day those trucks sit there, they are leaching value from your homes." The irony was lost on the board. Artie's trucks, the 1952 Chevy and the 1967 Ford, were actually worth more than the luxury SUVs parked in many of the homeowners' driveways. To Artie, they were a labor of love. To Richard, they were the leverage he needed to force the old man out. The psychological warfare began with the letters. At first, they were polite, friendly reminders from the HOA regarding community standards. Artie, being the stoic soul he was, simply tossed them into a shoebox. He knew he wasn't part of their association. His land was older than the state's current zoning laws, and his family had the original 1905 land grant to prove it. But Richard Thorne wasn't playing a fair game. He was playing a game of attrition. By the 8th month of this campaign, the tone of the letters shifted from reminders to directives. I remember visiting Grandpa for our usual Sunday coffee when he handed me a thick envelope. The letterhead was official, stamped with the HOA's logo, but the contents were insane. It claimed that a recent resurvey of the area suggested that the Sterling property line actually extended into the HOA's common territory. Because of this supposed overlap, Richard Thorne argued that the entire Sterling Ranch was now legally subject to HOA jurisdiction. The demands were staggering. Artie was ordered to paint his historic cedar fence white to match the community aesthetic, remove his cattle due to agricultural nuisance complaints, and most offensively, pay $45,000 in back dues for the past 15 years of HOA membership he never signed up for. "Leo," Artie said, his voice steady but his eyes flashing with a rare spark of anger. "This man is trying to bill me for the air I breathe on my own porch." I told him it was nonsense, a classic scare tactic from a retired lawyer who missed the courtroom. But Richard Thorne was moving faster than we realized. He started showing up at the fence line with a pair of men in orange vests, carrying expensive laser-leveling surveying equipment. Richard would point at the ground, gesturing wildly toward Artie's barn and the trucks parked neatly inside. Whenever Artie tried to approach them to ask what they were doing on his boundary, Richard would simply wave his hand dismissively. "You'll be hearing from our legal team, Mr. Sterling," he would call out with a smirk. "Enjoy the view while it lasts." Artie, being a man of the old school, believed that if you ignored a barking dog long enough, it would eventually get tired and go home. He continued his routine, waking up at 5:00 a.m. to tend to the ranch, unaware that Richard had already filed a lien against the Sterling property with the county. Richard Thorne wasn't just barking anymore. He was preparing to bite, and he was aiming for the heart of the ranch, Artie's trucks. The peace of the Sterling Ranch was about to be shattered by the sound of a heavy-duty tow truck. While Artie was at a routine doctor's appointment, Richard Thorne decided to stop sending letters and start taking collateral. The turning point in this war happened on a Tuesday in late autumn. My grandfather, Artie, had a routine checkup at the cardiologist in the city, a 2-hour drive from the ranch. For Richard Thorne, this was the window of opportunity he had been waiting for. He didn't just want to win a legal argument, he wanted to break Artie's spirit. When Artie pulled his old farm truck up the gravel driveway that afternoon, the silence of the ranch felt heavy, almost unnatural. He looked toward the equipment barn where his pride and joy usually sat gleaming under the rafters. The doors were wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. He stepped out of his truck, his heart racing, and not because of his medical condition. The 1952 Chevy 3100, the 1967 Ford F100, and the 1971 Chevrolet C10 were gone. In their place, tacked to the barn door with a heavy-duty staple, was a bright orange notice of seizure. I arrived an hour later after receiving a frantic, breathless call from him. I found Artie standing on his porch, clutching that orange paper so hard his knuckles were white. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, but there was a fire in his eyes that replaced the initial shock. The HOA, under Richard's direct orders, had authorized a private towing company to enter the property and remove inoperable and non-compliant vehicles. The audacity of the document was breathtaking. It stated that because Artie had ignored the previous notices regarding his unauthorized presence on HOA-claimed land, the association had exercised its right to impound the vehicles. To get them back, Artie would have to pay $8,500 in towing and storage fees immediately. But that was just the bait. The real hook was the administrative lien they had placed on the ranch. Between the alleged 15 years of back dues, interest, legal fees, and the impound costs, Richard Thorne was demanding a total of $53,000. "They think they can just come onto my land and take my life's work," Artie whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. I was packing the porch, already dialing my phone. "Grandpa, this has to be illegal. They cannot just tow cars off private property based on a letter they wrote themselves." Artie took a deep breath, his decades of experience as a county surveyor suddenly anchoring him. He looked out over the fence line toward the subdivision. He saw Richard Thorne standing on his own second-story balcony, watching us through a pair of binoculars like a vulture waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "Richard thinks he's a shark because he knows the law," Artie said, his voice dropping to a calm, dangerous tone I hadn't heard since I was a child. "But he's forgotten one thing. He's playing on my map. He's used to dealing with people who are afraid of a courtroom. He doesn't realize he just gave me exactly what I needed to finish this." I was confused. "What are you talking about? They have the trucks, Grandpa. They have a lien on the ranch." "A lien is just a piece of paper filed with the county," Artie explained, a slow, knowing smile finally breaking across his face. "And I worked at that county office for 40 years. I know exactly how those records are kept, how they are filed, and more importantly, how they are messed up. Richard is basing all of this on a survey his brother-in-law, Brad Miller, did for the developer 15 years ago." Artie walked into his study, a room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound ledgers and rolled-up blueprints. He pulled out a worn wooden box containing his old brass surveying instruments, tools that looked like antiques but were calibrated to perfection. "Richard wants to talk about property lines," Artie said, tapping a vintage map spread across his desk. "Then we're going to talk about every single inch of this county. If he wants a war over a few feet of dirt, I'm going to give him a landslide." While Richard Thorne was celebrating his victory at the local country club, Artie was preparing to go full detective mode. Over the next 3 days, he would discover a secret buried in the county archives that would not only protect the ranch, but threaten to tear down the very foundation of the HOA's most expensive assets. While Richard Thorne was likely clinking glasses at the country club, celebrating the repossession of what he called industrial junk, Arthur Sterling was back in his element. The study of the ranch house transformed into a war room. Artie didn't just have memories of his 40 years at the County Surveyor's office. He had a personal archive that was a goldmine of historical data. He spent the next 72 hours submerged in a sea of yellowed vellum maps, property records, and land grant documents that dated back to the early 1900s. "Richard thinks he can use a 15-year-old survey to undo 120 years of history," Artie muttered, his eyes scanning a map through a heavy magnifying glass. "He's relying on Brad Miller's work, and I remember Brad. He was the kind of man who'd measure a mile with a broken yardstick if it meant getting home in time for dinner." Artie wasn't just guessing. He pulled out his own field notes from the 1970s, the last time the county had performed a comprehensive official update of the rural boundaries. He cross-referenced those certified stamps with the original 1905 land grant his father had signed. Slowly, A massive, glaring discrepancy began to emerge, a mistake so fundamental it was almost beautiful in its disaster. Determined to be precise, Artie headed out into the field at dawn on the fourth day. He carried his old brass theodolite and a set of professional-grade measuring chains. I watched from the porch as the 78-year-old man moved with a rejuvenated purpose, driving stakes into the dirt and peering through the lens of his transit. He wasn't just looking for his trucks. He was hunting for the golden corner, the primary survey marker that anchored the entire section of the county. By noon, Artie called me over to the eastern fence line, the one that separated our quiet pasture from the manicured lawns of the meadows. He was pointing at a spot about 20 feet deep into the HOA's common area, right near the edge of their lavish, heated community pool. "Leo, look at this," he said, handing me the coordinates. "When the developer built those homes 15 years ago, they didn't just estimate the boundary. Brad Miller used a faulty reference point, likely a displaced fence post instead of the actual iron pin buried 3 feet underground. He shifted the entire subdivision's western boundary about 20 feet onto our land." I looked at the pool, the sprawling $250,000 playground, and the massive 2-story clubhouse where Richard held his board meetings. "Grandpa, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that Richard Thorne is currently trespassing on Sterling land every time he goes for a swim," Artie said, a sharp, cold grin spreading across his face. "That clubhouse, built on my dirt, that pool, half of it belongs to the cattle, and that playground where they don't want to see my eyesore trucks, that's sitting right on top of my family's legacy." The scale of the error was staggering. Approximately 2,300 square feet of the HOA's most prized amenities were technically illegal encroachments on the Sterling Ranch. Richard Thorne had been so focused on seizing 3 vintage trucks that he had completely failed to realize his entire organization was built on a foundation of sand. Artie folded his maps with a methodical click of his briefcase. "He wanted to talk about back dues and compliance," Artie chuckled, the sound echoing across the hills. "Well, I think it's time we discuss the rental rate for a clubhouse that's been sitting on my land for 15 years without a lease." We didn't call the police, and we didn't call the HOA. Instead, we called the best real estate litigator in the state. When the lawyer saw Artie's documentation, his eyes went wide, and he told us that we weren't just going to get the trucks back. We were about to own the HOA's future. The air in the office of Marcus Vance, the city's most formidable real estate litigator, was thick with the scent of old leather and expensive espresso. Marcus had spent 30 years dismantling corporate giants, but as he looked over the documents Artie had laid out, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, tapping the 1905 land grant and the fresh survey data Artie had compiled. "In my world, we call this a nuclear option. Richard Thorne hasn't just overstepped. He has walked off a cliff and hasn't realized he's in midair yet." The plan was simple but devastating. We weren't just going to fight the $53,000 lien or the towing of the trucks. We were going to challenge the very existence of the HOA's most valuable assets. While Richard was busy drafting more violation notices, Marcus was filing a multi-pronged lawsuit that would hit the meadows like a seismic wave. The first strike was the cease and desist. It wasn't about the trucks, it was about the land. We sent a formal notice to the HOA Board of Directors, not just Richard, stating that an independent survey had confirmed a massive encroachment. We informed them that their $250,000 community clubhouse, the Olympic-sized heated pool, and the tot lot playground were sitting on private Sterling property. The second strike was the invoice for unpaid land lease. Artie and Marcus calculated the fair market rental value. For the 2,300 square feet of land the HOA had been renting from the Sterling family without a contract for the last 15 years. With interest and property tax adjustments, the bill came to a staggering $275,000. "But we're not done," Artie said, leaning back in his chair. "I want my trucks back, Marcus, and I want them back in better condition than when they were taken." A week later, the nuke was dropped. Richard Thorne was presiding over a routine HOA meeting in the clubhouse, the very building that was now the subject of our lawsuit. He was mid-sentence, complaining about a resident's choice of mulch, when the heavy oak doors swung open. Marcus Vance walked in, followed by 2 process servers. The room went silent as Marcus handed Richard a thick stack of legal papers. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "I'm here on behalf of Arthur Sterling. You are currently trespassing on his property. In fact, this entire building is currently occupying land that belongs to the Sterling Ranch. You have 24 hours to respond to our demand for $275,000 in back rent, or we will be filing an injunction to have this clubhouse condemned and demolished." The color drained from Richard's face, turning him a shade of gray that matched his expensive suit. The other board members began whispering frantically. Richard tried to regain his composure, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "This is absurd. We have surveys." "My brother-in-law, Brad Miller." "Ah, yes, Brad Miller," Marcus interrupted, pulling out a document from the county archives. "The man whose license was suspended 3 years ago for gross negligence in boundary determination. We've already submitted his 2009 survey to the state board for review. It's riddled with errors, Richard. And because you used those errors to illegally seize my client's personal property, we are also filing criminal charges for grand theft auto." At the mention of grand theft auto, the room erupted into chaos. Homeowners who had been bullied by Richard for years were now looking at him with daggers in their eyes. They realized that their HOA dues, their hard-earned money, were about to be swallowed up by a massive legal blunder that Richard had provoked. Artie stood at the back of the room, his hands in his pockets, watching the man who had tried to steal his legacy crumble. Richard looked at Artie, his mouth agape, searching for a way out. Artie simply tipped his cap, just like he used to do at the fence line. "Check your math, Richard," Artie said quietly. "It's a lot harder to move a clubhouse than it is to move a truck." The HOA was in a blind panic. Richard Thorne was facing a revolt from his own neighbors, and the towing company, fearing a massive lawsuit, had already called Artie to ask where they should deliver the trucks, free of charge. But Artie wasn't ready to settle yet. He wanted to make sure Richard Thorne never bullied another person again. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse was no longer one of suburban prestige. It was a powder keg. Word of the $275,000 invoice and the impending demolition of the community pool had spread through the meadows faster than a wildfire. When Richard Thorne tried to call the emergency meeting to order the following evening, he wasn't met with the usual bored silence. He was met with a wall of angry, terrified homeowners who realized their property values were about to be incinerated. Artie and I sat in the very last row. He looked calm, wearing his Sunday best, leaning on his cane, the very picture of a man who knew exactly how the movie was going to end. Richard stood at the podium, sweating under the LED recessed lighting. "Now, everyone, please," he stammered, his hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses. "This is a simple clerical error. Mr. Sterling's legal team is using intimidation tactics. Our original surveys from the development phase clearly show." "They show a lie, Richard," a woman from the third row screamed. It was Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood's most active gardener, and someone Richard had fined $500 the previous month for having the wrong species of roses. "We've all seen the county records now. You didn't just make a mistake. You sent your own brother-in-law to fake a survey so you could claim land that wasn't yours." The crowd roared in agreement. Richard's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. He looked toward the HOA's legal counsel, a young man who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Counsel," Richard prompted desperately. The HOA lawyer stood up slowly. "Based on the 1905 land grant and the certified markers found by Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the Sterling Ranch boundary does indeed bisect the clubhouse. Legally, the HOA is currently operating a business on private property without a permit or a lease. Furthermore, the seizure of the vehicles was based on the premise that the Sterling Ranch was under HOA jurisdiction, a premise that is now officially proven false. The room went deathly quiet. This was the confirmation they all feared. Richard Thorne had not only opened the HOA up to a $250,000 debt, but he had also committed what looked like a series of felonies in the process. "We want you out, Richard," shouted a man near the front. "You've bankrupted us. You've put a lien on our common areas because of your personal vendetta against an old man and his trucks." It was a total revolt. One by one, the board members, the very people who had once enabled Richard, stood up and resigned their positions on the spot, refusing to be associated with his criminal negligence. By the end of the hour, a motion was passed by a landslide. Richard Thorne was removed as president, and the new interim board was authorized to negotiate a settlement with Artie Sterling immediately. But Artie wasn't finished. As the meeting broke into chaotic groups, he walked slowly up to the podium. The room fell silent as the old man they had all ignored for 15 years took the mic. "I don't want your clubhouse," Artie said, his voice echoing with a natural authority that Richard could never mimic. "And I don't want to see your families lose their pool, but I spent 40 years making sure the lines in this county were straight." Richard Thorne tried to bend them to suit his ego. Artie looked Richard dead in the eye. Richard couldn't even maintain eye contact. He was staring at the floor, ruined. "I'm going to offer the HOA a choice," Artie continued. "You can pay the back rent and the damages for my trucks, or you can watch the bulldozers come for this building. But there's one more condition. Richard Thorne has to be gone, not just from the board, from the neighborhood. I want his house on the market by Monday." The homeowners didn't hesitate. They didn't care about Richard anymore. They cared about their investment. The predator of the meadows was now the prey. As we walked out of the clubhouse, Artie's phone buzzed. It was the towing company. They weren't just returning the trucks. They were offering to detail them for free and deliver them in an enclosed trailer to avoid any further legal complications. But there was one secret left to uncover, one that would explain exactly why Richard was so desperate to get Artie off that specific piece of land. With Richard Thorne effectively exiled from the HOA board, the atmosphere shifted from open warfare to a desperate scramble for damage control. The interim board, led by a pragmatic civil engineer named Sarah Jenkins, knew they were one court date away from total bankruptcy. But as Artie and I dug deeper into the records to finalize the settlement, we discovered that Richard's obsession with the Sterling Ranch wasn't just about aesthetic standards or vintage trucks. There was a much darker, much more expensive secret buried beneath the dirt. While reviewing the HOA's long-term development plans, documents we obtained through a legal discovery motion, Artie's sharp eyes caught a discrepancy in the drainage and sewage blueprints. "Look here, Leo," Artie said, pointing at a technical diagram of the subdivision's infrastructure. "This is why Richard was so desperate to push me off the eastern ridge. It wasn't about the view, it was about the water." As it turned out, the developer, in an effort to save millions during the initial construction, had diverted the entire subdivision's primary storm drainage system directly toward the Sterling Ranch's lower pasture. According to the original and legal county permits, they were supposed to build a massive underground detention vault. Instead, they had simply graded the land so that all the runoff from 50 rooftops and paved streets would quietly flood Artie's back acreage during heavy rains. Richard Thorne, being a real estate attorney, had discovered this flaw years ago. He knew that if Artie ever decided to develop his own land, or if the county did a surprise inspection, the HOA would be liable for millions in environmental damages and infrastructure reconstruction. Richard's plan was to absorb the Sterling Ranch into the HOA through the fake survey, effectively making the drainage issue a community problem, rather than a legal liability for the board and the developer. By seizing Artie's trucks and placing a lien on the ranch, he hoped to bankrupt the old man and force a foreclosure, allowing the HOA to buy the land for pennies on the dollar and bury the evidence forever. When Sarah Jenkins and the new board saw this evidence, The blood drained from their faces. They weren't just looking at a $275,000 land lease debt anymore. They were looking at a multi-million-dollar federal environmental violation. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, her voice trembling during our settlement meeting at Marcus Vance's office. "We had no idea. Richard told us the drainage was up to code. He told us your trucks were the only thing devaluing our homes." Artie leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the mahogany table. "Richard lied to you to protect his own skin. He didn't care if your basements flooded in 10 years or if my cattle drowned in 20. He just wanted the paper trail to disappear." Marcus Vance stepped in, laying out the terms of the great settlement. We had the HOA over a barrel. We could have sued them into non-existence, forcing every homeowner to pay a special assessment of $50,000 or more. But Artie wasn't looking for a pound of flesh from his neighbors. He just wanted his peace back. The settlement terms were legendary. The cash: the HOA would pay Artie $185,000 immediately to cover the land lease and the emotional distress caused by the illegal seizure of his trucks. The trucks: the HOA had to pay an additional $15,000 for professional restoration of the trucks, ensuring they were in better than factory condition. The perpetual lease: instead of tearing down the clubhouse, Artie agreed to lease the encroached land to the HOA for $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, for the next 99 years. This ensured Artie a steady retirement income while letting the neighbors keep their pool. The infrastructure fix: the HOA agreed to pay for a proper, engineered drainage wall and culvert system to protect the Sterling Ranch. Funded by a lawsuit the HOA would now file against the original developer, with Artie as their star witness. The Thorne Clause: Richard Thorne had to sell his home and vacate the subdivision within 60 days. The board signed the papers with shaky hands, relieved to have escaped total annihilation. But as Richard Thorne walked out of his house for the last time 2 months later, he had to drive past the Sterling Ranch one last time. Artie had one final surprise waiting for Richard on his way out of town. It was a display that would ensure Richard Thorne never forgot the name Arthur Sterling for as long as he lived. The dust had finally settled on the legal battlefield, but for Artie Sterling, the victory wasn't complete until the physical world reflected the justice he had won on paper. The 60-day deadline for Richard Thorne to vacate his property was up. Richard, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his pride, had spent his final weeks in the meadows, hiding behind closed curtains as neighbors. People he had once fined for the smallest infractions now openly laughed when he walked to his mailbox. On the morning of Richard's departure, a heavy, enclosed car carrier pulled up the gravel driveway of the Sterling Ranch. One by one, the vintage trucks were backed out. They didn't just look restored. They looked like they had just rolled off a factory line in the mid-20th century. The chrome on the 1952 Chevy 3100 was so bright it could blind you in the midday sun. The 1967 Ford F-100 purred with a deep, rhythmic rumble that spoke of American muscle, and the 1971 C-10 sparkled in a new coat of sunset orange. Artie didn't put them back in the barn. Instead, he used the $15,000 restoration fund provided by the HOA to build something special. Right along the 20-foot strip of land that the HOA was now officially leasing from him. The strip that sat directly in front of the clubhouse and Richard Thorne's exit route. Artie had installed a row of concrete display pads, complete with solar-powered spotlights. As Richard Thorne's moving truck rumbled toward the subdivision exit, he had to drive past the very eyesores he had tried to destroy. There they were, 3 masterpieces of automotive history parked on the very land Richard had tried to steal. Beside the trucks, Artie had placed a small, tastefully engraved plaque on a stone pedestal. It read, "Sterling Ranch, established 1905, measured twice, stolen never." Artie was sitting on a lawn chair next to the display, sipping a cold lemonade. As Richard's truck crawled by, the 2 men locked eyes. Richard looked like a ghost of the man he used to be. Artie didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply raised his glass in a silent toast. Richard looked away, staring straight ahead at a future where he was no longer the king of his own little hill. With the $185,000 settlement, Artie ensured the ranch would be protected for another century. He set up a trust fund that would cover the property taxes and maintenance long after he was gone. The $1,000 a month in rent from the HOA clubhouse went directly into a scholarship fund for local kids who wanted to study. You guessed it, civil engineering and land surveying. The meadows changed after that. Without Richard's reign of terror, the HOA became what it was always meant to be, a group of neighbors helping neighbors. They even invited Artie to the annual summer barbecue. He accepted on one condition, that he could park his '67 Ford right next to the pool, on his own land, of course. The Sterling Ranch remains a landmark, a 45-acre reminder that while the world might change and suburbs might grow, you can never truly bury the truth, especially if the man you're burying it from knows exactly how to read a map. And that, everyone, is why you should never try to outsmart someone who has spent 40 years measuring the world for a living. Artie didn't just get his trucks back. He turned a corrupt HOA into his personal landlord. If you enjoyed seeing a bully like Richard Thorne get exactly what he deserved, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel bring you more stories of epic, pro-revenge. What would you have done if an HOA towed your property? Would you have gone to court, or would you have found a way to take the whole clubhouse like Artie did? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story where the little guy, or the legendary old guy, comes out on top. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.